Continuing from last segment, we were discussing Egypt after 1900. Throughout most of the interwar period, the Wafd party remained very popular party in Egypt. And during this period, two young lieutenants, one by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser and the other by the name of Anwar Sadat, actually joined the party. If you recall, Zaghloul Pasha, the leader of the party, of the delegation Wafd, died in 1927, and Zaghloul was one of those truly charismatic leaders who actually groomed a successor who will become the leader of that party. His name was Nahas Pasha. However, as we shall see, Nahas Pasha was much more accommodating to the British than Zaghloul. So British at this point told Nahas Pasha that if he is willing to be a moderate, responsible leader, they would let him become prime minister and let him even have free election. And amazingly enough, Nahas Pasha agreed to those terms. The only concessions that he was able to extract from the British were relatively minor one of which was to change the title of the commissioner to that of an ambassador. And then few mostly cosmetic changes, symbolic changes were enacted. So between 1928 and 1952, Nahas Pasha would serve as the Prime Minister of Egypt on 5 different occasions. Now, going back to the late 1920s and early 1930s, if you are looking at the leaders of Egypt, the thing to remember is that the phenomena that attracts them the most is Egyptian nationalism. In other words, these leaders are Egyptian nationalists. And if you think about what's happening in that period, there's a strong feeling that they're being sold out by Nahas Pasha. Certainly, Nasser and Sadat, both future presidents of Egypt, felt that they were being sold out by Nahas Pasha. In the meantime, Wafd won an election, but then very quickly it began to splinter. So Wafd splinters was in the following manner. First of all, let me say that Wafd, you got to remember, was just like the National Front in Iran, was a coalition of several parties that was held together by their common aim, which was defeat of the British and true independence for Egypt. When Nahas Pasha began to make those concessions and began to actually serve the British, the splintering was easy to understand. And part of the splinters came along the following line. The first group were the green shirts. Green, of course, is the color of Islam. And the fact that this group, however, was not really Islamic, as you will see, they were in some sense an outcropping of the influence of 1936 Germany. And remember, this is a period that Nazism is beginning to advance in Germany. The party was pro-Nazi, and later on when we discuss Lebanese politics, you will see that at the same time there was also a similar movement in Lebanon, and the Phalange party was part of that. They're all pro-Nazi. I mean, they're Nazi sympathizer or fascist sympathizers. This was a popular party in large part, at least in those period, because of its also anti-British feeling. And Sadat actually ends up joining that fascist party. The second one are the Akhwanis. This is the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Akhwanis have two important leaders. The party was founded in 1928, and it is becoming, or it was becoming, very, very important party, not just in Egypt, but really in good part of the region. Both Nasser and Sadat joined it briefly as well. The leaders of that party, there are two of them. One of them is Hassan al-Banna. The second one, in some way, is more important, Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was a brilliant theoretician and theologian who began to give a sense of efficacy to the Islamic movements. He traveled to the United States, actually, before going back, and what he observed in the West and in the United States was utter decadence. He came here during the so-called Roaring Twenties, so you can imagine the kind of impression he would have going back. So when he got back, he knew that the Muslims should chart a very, very different world than what was being offered to them in terms of West and modernization and so forth. He was to be executed later on by Nasser because he became enemy of Nasser, and Nasser actually ended up executing him. The third group from the splinter of the Wafd party are the Communist Party of Egypt. Now, you would expect, as we saw in other parts of the Middle East, and as we shall see in other parts of the Middle East, that much more of the intellectual core of the society would end up joining it, and yet in Egypt that did not occur. So the question is why? I could speculate as to why. The head of the Communist Party of Egypt was a Jew, and remember that in the 1930s the Palestinian issue was becoming increasingly important to the Arab intellectuals. In the 1930s, remember, most of the Arab world is in a pre-mass politics, but the intellectuals and the urban population is becoming politically participant. So probably that had something to do with the Communist Party of Egypt not being able to attract most of the intellectuals in the way, for example, that the Tudeh party in Iran was able to attract the cream of the crop. Or in Syria and other places, or even in Jordan, the Communist Party was able to attract a lot of the intellectuals, but not so in the case of Egypt. So in 1942, moving ahead, the British decide that it would be a good idea for Egyptians to declare war against the Axis powers. So remember, we're into the beginning of World War II. British really were concerned with Marshal Rommel's advances in North Africa, and also Italy under Mussolini was already in Libya. And now remember also that Egypt is still, at least nominally, a monarchy. Its ruler is one King Farouk, a descendant of Muhammad Ali. And Farouk was a very stupid king. One of his claim to fame was that he had the largest collection of pornographic movies in the region. So you can imagine what type of an individual we're dealing with. But the point that I would like to make is this. Nonetheless, Farouk was smart enough to realize that he shouldn't bow to the British pressures and declare war on Axis power. Why? Well, virtually everyone in the region, not just in Egypt, everyone in the region hated the British and were earnestly hoping that they would lose the war to Germany. So, realizing just how unpopular the British were, Farouk refused to declare war on the Axis. So next, the British, piqued by Farouk's insubordination, surround the palace and actually have the chutzpah to read an abdication letter for him. So they dismiss him. But then, quite amazingly, they got the leader of the Waft party, the one that we mentioned, Nahas Pasha, succeeding Zaghloul, to do what Farouk had the smarts to refuse to do, to declare war on the Axis power. That became a defining moment for the Waft party. It marked the beginning of the end for the Waft, and in a sense for Egypt's experiment with democracy. It would take overt British support to allow Waft to stay in power for 2 more years, but by 1944, Waft breaks down and loses elections. The main beneficiaries of the demise of the Waft party or coalition are, as you would guess by now, learning from the patterns from Iran, are the anti-democratic political organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, remember, this is a familiar pattern throughout the region. Whenever nascent liberal democracies are undermined at this very fragile existence that they are experiencing, the vacuum they leave behind is soon filled by anti-democratic forces who end up actually becoming dominant. So by 1952, as we mentioned, we get a revolution. Before going to the 1952 revolution, I want to make a couple of observations. First of all, as I suggested, it is noteworthy that the Egyptian leaders of the Waft party in the late 1920s and 30s were all Egyptian nationalists, not Arab nationalists. In other words, their attachment was to the territory of Egypt. Beginning in 1930s, however, 2 tendencies begin to manifest themselves, both in Egypt as well as in Greater Syria. In many ways, Greater Syria was at that time more politically participant, and in many ways it was the intellectual hub of the Arab world. What are these 2 tendencies? First, they begin to talk seriously about the region and its political role. This is really something new. They did not used to do this. They're beginning to ponder why they do not have independence from the imperial powers. The second thing is that they start to refer to themselves as Arabs. In other words, this notion of Arab identities begin to blossom, and its effervescence are beginning to be widespread. So this is reflected really in the growing recognition by the Egyptians that they shared with Arabs and Arabic-speaking people the humiliation of Western imperialism. Now, 2 developments also were responsible for these 2 trends to manifest themselves. One was development in Palestine, because important things were happening there. Recall that British took over Palestine as a mandate after World War II, and then the Jewish immigration into the area really picks up. To the Arabs, it looks like an invasion of European and imposition of European population on the Muslims. As this happens, this sense of Arabness in the region begins to grow. Where is the evidence? Well, a good evidence is that you begin to see that newspapers are devoting more and more space to the coverage of developments in Palestine during those periods. The second factor I already hinted at was the growth in political participation on the part of most of the masses in this area. So you suddenly are beginning to experience a big increase in the rank of the politically participant masses in all of that area. Now, what I'm really talking about is the identity, and I want to take a kind of a digression for now to map these identity pictures for you. And the mapping is based on what I call 3 modal identity types in Egypt. The word modal calls for an explanation. It shouldn't be confused with model. Modal comes from one of the measures of central tendency called the mode. And in this context think of it as a typical, if there is such a thing. But the modal identity types, in the case of Egypt, I want to map that out, are the following. It's identity with Egypt as a state and as a territory and as a culture, identity with Arab, and then identity with that Islamic community Ummah. And I want to give the profile of 3 modal types of individual to see how Egypt, different identities were actually playing out. Now I'm going to be using what I call an ordinal scale, which just, it doesn't communicate a lot of hard numbers. It's just a rank order, with 1 being the highest attachment and 3 being the lowest attachment, and of course 2 being the middling level. So if you look at the Egyptian nationalist, as you would guess, the strongest attachment, well, let me give you the other 2 characters. The other one is a pan-Arab, and the third one is Islamist. So let's go back to 1, Egyptian nationalist. As you would expect, the attachment to Egypt would be at the highest level, so it gets the ranking of 1. If you're truly Egyptian nationalist, you would rank your attachment to Arab and to Ummah at the lower level. So the Egyptian nationalists really cared only about Egypt. Arab and Ummah was not as important. So you can also imagine that most of these people are very secular rather than religious people. The Pan-Arabs, in the case of Pan-Arabs, again, for Egyptian, Egypt still is number 1, but Pan-Arab is right below it. So I give it 1.5 ranking. Most of the Pan-Arabs were also secular in orientation, so they get a 3 ranking under the Ummah in terms of attachment. And then finally, the Islamicists. I give them a ranking of 1.5, both on Egypt and on Arab. The highest ranking for them is reserved for the Ummah. So you have these 3 prototype modal identities happening in Egypt around the time that I'm talking about, 1930s, 1940s, with the Egyptian nationalists having the highest attachment to Egypt, Pan-Arab, very, very closely, even though they're attached to Egypt, but Arab is very important to them. Later on, I will give you a true Arab nationalist when we talk about other mapping, that you will see that they don't care about their own country, they just care about the unity. And only 1 person really falls in that category. So that's the model that I wanted to run by you, so you're getting an idea about different types of identity formations in Egypt in that period. The second thing that I want to depict is the political trends in Egypt. And these political trends are depicted in the following way. The red line really represents the political participation growth. You will see that it started very, very low, close to 1%, and it begins to pick up from 1930s, 1940s onward. The other line is the Egyptian nationalism and Pan-Arab or Arab nationalism, and also Islam. A good part of what we call Arab nationalists are the followers of Nasser's, and the part that relates to Egyptian nationalism, you will see, are mostly followers of President Sadat.